little sweetheart.
They can't do nothing because I tap dance.
This is WVCR 88.3 FM, The Saint. You are listening to Calling Out Controversy, featuring hosts Andrew Hecht and Justin Kenyon. Hey everybody, welcome to Calling Out Controversy. It's Andrew Hecht.
And Justin Kenyon.
And we're here this week with a very special guest. We have Dan Behrman, Libertarian Party candidate for president. We had him on the phone earlier, and we recorded a nice, very long interview for you guys. Unfortunately, he couldn't be here with us in person because he lives in Cancun, Mexico. So
this should be a fun one.
Yeah, you're going to learn a lot. It was a pleasure to talk to him, and it's very interesting. Honestly, I encourage all of you to listen to the full thing, especially the end.
Especially
if you have to
end.
skip around, if you don't want to give him the full time, it's an hour. You very much should give him the full time, but if you can't, just make sure you hit up the end amongst the pieces.
The end was very eye-opening.
Yeah. Now, obviously, there have been some tragic events this past weekend in Dayton, Ohio, in El Paso, Texas, and it's been a rough time. Right now, neither Justin nor I think it's appropriate to discuss what's going on involving those cases because neither of us are knowledgeable of the case to a degree that would warrant a discussion. We know very minimal things. There's still stories developing. There's still evidence being found. They're still investigating. So it doesn't make sense to start a ruckus.
No, not at all. I mean, like, something could change within the story within the next, 5 minutes or so.
Every day there's a new development in one of these two stories. So, to be honest, we don't want to jump on the bandwagon. We're all about calling out controversy, but we're not going to start calling out things that might not even be true or things that we can't verifiably say for certain. We only know three things from each of these cases. It's not worth a discussion. So we're going to take a very early break, because it's a very long interview, a very good interview that, Dan, Mr. Behrman, presidential hopeful, Dan
Taxationist Theft Behrman.
Taxationist Theft Behrman.
With his hat and all his glory, looking like the
We didn't ask him about the hat.
I wanted to, but you told me no.
But yeah, Dan Behrman's here. If you don't know the reference to the hat, just look it up. He wears a very interesting hat. But we wanted to stick to more serious topics. Too. Yeah, we wanted to stick to more serious topics, though. And it's very informational. It definitely gave me some perspective and things to think about. So without further ado, let's take that quick mandatory break we always have to take.
Let's get to it.
And then we'll get right on with Dan Behrman right after these messages, these sponsorship messages. Hi, FCC.
Hi, nonprofits.
On WVCR 88.3 FM, The Saint. And you good?
Yeah, you can start.
All right. Welcome to Calling Out Controversy. We have a very special episode today. With us is Dan Behrman, Libertarian Party candidate for the 2020 presidential race. Mr. Behrman, how you doing?
Hey, doing pretty good. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, no problem. This is an honor.
Yeah, it's definitely great to have you.
Yeah, absolutely. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your campaign, how you got into the race, and what your platform is?
Sure. So I've kind of got a long history of not wanting to be involved in politics at all. But growing up in California, I leaned more Democrat, and then I kind of, through the housing bubble in 2008, I kind of learned about Ron Paul and became a Republican. And from there, I still wasn't happy, so I kept searching for other answers, and I came across the Libertarian Party. And even there, even though I agree with them the most now, I still didn't find what I was looking for. So that's kind of why I decided, hey, if you want something done right, you got to do it yourself, and that's why I'm running.
Okay. I can relate. I'm also a libertarian, so
Awesome.
I understand that struggle.
Yeah, it's and we see even in the Libertarian Party, like one thing that I see is everybody's kind of got this idea. We get there because we have a different idea of how we want to live our lives, and it's maybe it's not always the norm, and because of that, there's always someone who's speaking out and saying like, hey, you shouldn't do this because that's not what everybody else does, and I think that kind of gives a little struggle between all of us because we're also all saying, well, we should be able to do things this way. And then it's like, okay, now we all have our different ways of doing things, and we still have to come up with this compromise. How do we live cooperative with each other in the same world, knowing that we all have like a different idea of, what our ideal life would be?
Yeah. Yeah, so why don't we start this off with probably the most basic presidential interview question, which is, why do you want to be president?
I don't.
Okay.
Really the reason that I'm doing this is because all these other presidential candidates that I see, they're getting up there and they're saying, look, this is the way things should be, and they want to force it on us. And that's really just not acceptable to me. So,
Okay.
The reason that I am running is I don't want to be that. I don't want to tell people how to run their lives. What I want to do is I want to look at all of the processes that we have in government, all these systems and organizations and branches and agencies, and I want to look at them and say, look, are these really necessary? Because if they're interfering with my life or somebody else's life, they shouldn't be there. We should all be free to live our own lives, and we shouldn't need, a president or a government to dictate how we should live our lives. We should be free. The government should really only be there for conflict resolution and protecting our rights, if anything. That's kind of to say I don't want to be president doesn't mean I don't want to win. It means, hey, nobody understands this. Nobody gets that we can't go around telling everybody how to live their lives. We have to figure out a way that we can all get what we want, and we can all get what we want if we stop trying to take it away from somebody else.
So basically your biggest platform would be keeping everybody in the government separate from each other, like keeping the government out of everybody's lives then.
Well, yeah, it's a minimalization.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's that's really what basic freedom is about. When this country was founded, the people who put it together, I know there was a lot of debate going back and forth about what the government should be, but a lot of them, basically said the government should be very, very, very small. It shouldn't, most of us shouldn't have to interact with it in the course of our daily lives. And that's what freedom is about, and that's what we fought many wars to achieve.
Yeah. So let me ask you a question. You mentioned assessing government and seeing what works, what doesn't work, what's necessary, what's unnecessary. Could you give us an example of what you believe currently is an unnecessary role of government?
Sure. So a big one is, especially because everybody's talking about health care, a big one is the FDA. And I know this gets kind of controversial because a lot of people think, well, hey, I want to make sure that my doctors know what they're doing. I want to make sure that the drugs that I'm taking or medications that I'm taking are safe. And that's what the FDA does. But we need to look at this and say, look, the FDA has a monopoly, and we know monopolies are bad. Whenever you hear about, whether the phone company has a monopoly or an internet company, monopolies are bad. So why are we allowing the government to have a monopoly?
Well,
When we look at the FDA, we should be able to say, look, if maybe you don't want a private company because you think private companies are evil. Maybe you don't want a private company to say which drugs are safe for you to use. But other people might be okay with that. So we should at least, when it comes to the FDA, we should at least remove the monopoly and allow another company to approve drugs for use and sale. And when we do that, if we start to see, yeah, go ahead.
All right. Well, I just wanted to go off a little other tangent too. Like, what would be if you were to be elected? What would be the first thing that you do on your first day in office?
Well, let's finish the FDA conversation first.
You want to go with that first?
Yeah,
Andrew?
because he brought up an interesting point, and I personally don't like the FDA either.
Okay.
However, I would argue that when it comes to private regulatory agencies, we've already seen, for example, in the 2008 financial collapse, that there were ratings agencies for firms, Standard & Poor's and Moody's specifically, that were being bought out. They were utterly corrupt, and they weren't punished. But the government does have one of its three basic roles to be to regulate fair trade. And while I don't agree with the FDA interfering and over-regulating, there should still at least be a regulatory agency that's responsible to the people.
Okay.
So I want to know what you think about that, sir.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the thing. Look, if we go in there and day one we say, hey, FDA's gone, that's going to cause a lot of problems because now we don't know what is safe. But if we get rid of the monopoly and say, another business is allowed to come along and they're able to create their own regulations for, what is safe and effective that can be sold on the market, and allow a couple other businesses to kind of create this, then I think we'll actually see something really successful there where we see drugs getting to market faster. We see safer drugs. We don't see companies being protected by the FDA, from lawsuits by saying, well, hey, the FDA approved it, so, any damage it caused, we're not liable for it. And when you look at, Universal Laboratories, which is basically a private regulatory agency, if you think about it, over electronics, it's really done that way. It's a private agency that regulates that in an industry where, consumer electronics used to be dangerous. There's electricity everywhere, and electricity can be dangerous. UL Laboratories kind of created their own regulations for that, and it's not enforced by government, but most retail stores that you go to will not carry any products that aren't UL listed. So, I think that's we've seen that this is successful, and if we start to allow that competition, what we'll really see, which is the biggest problem when it comes to healthcare, is we'll start to see the costs falling dramatically, because of course that's the biggest issue with healthcare is the cost.
Wouldn't it be easier to just open the barriers to entry in the terms of medical equipment, manufacturing, pharmaceutical manufacturing? Again, I agree. The FDA, to me personally, is not doing they're doing too much. They're over-regulating in a lot of areas, especially with food and agriculture, especially when they incentivize GMOs and not local farmers, especially when they incentivize like pharmaceutical companies and they're preventing drugs to the market like we're discussing.
Yeah, big pharma and everything.
Yeah, they are just as corrupt as what I was bringing up with the financial crisis. However, the problem that I would see is that the way you're explaining it, especially with electronics, is that there's a trial and error period where you weed out the bad news.
Yeah. Which,
in terms of medical care, might be a little more lethal than electronics.
Sure, and we usually take care of that with lawsuits. A company is going to be worried about getting sued. They're going to be a lot safer with this. You can look at this in terms of, look at chemo. Chemo kills people. It kills almost every person who takes it. The success rate of chemo is very, very, very small, and yet we don't, people want to take it. It's, they know the dangers. They take it anyway because they're stuck with a terminal illness and their chances of survival are very low anyway. So when we look at healthcare, we have to consider that as a pretty big factor. These things are dangerous, and as long as people are aware of the dangers that they're taking on when they take these medications, and that might be part of the disclosure, that might be part of the rating system. As long as they're aware of that, then it should be the individual's choice as to whether or not they want to take that medication. There might be drugs that aren't approved at all, but hey, you've got a terminal illness and there's an experimental drug. We don't know the side effects. We don't know the success rate. We don't know anything about it. We just know you're going to die, and if you try this, it might help. Some people want to try those, and we've seen that with the right to try argument. As long as companies are clear about, how safe and how much testing have these medications have gone through, that's really the key. If somebody's lying about that and they say, hey, this thing's 100% safe, and then somebody takes it and, they develop another illness or a side effect that wasn't listed, then that company makes themselves vulnerable to lawsuit. And that's what really motivates a company like that to make sure that they are making sure things are safe before they go to market.
So what would be another extension of the government that you'd be looking to rail back?
Sure. So you mentioned on day one. Day one, what I'd actually do is start rescheduling some of the drugs so that cannabis is not a Schedule I drug. It never should have been. We're going to start pardoning people from prison who are in there for nonviolent drug charges. Possession of marijuana, possession of cocaine. These victimless crimes that have basically escalated because of the war on drugs. We're gonna shut the DEA down almost overnight. The war on drugs is really just a huge problem. It's a huge tax burden for everybody, and it's ruining. It's destroying millions of lives every year. It's really a travesty. So that's another big one. The IRS we're going to shut down, and a lot of the debt that we have, we're going to start defaulting on some of the debt to start decreasing what our national debt is.
Defaulting?
Yeah, I mean, doesn't that seem very risky, though?
No. Well, so when you look at the debt, you have to understand what it is, who it's owed to, and what's actually going to be the problem created from that. So when we look at, there's several trillions of dollars owed to the Federal Reserve Bank. This is a private bank that their skin in the game came from nothing. They lent money to the United States government that they didn't have. They basically did, a paper asset swap, which is kind of like a game of three-card Monte. We move some bonds over here, you print some money over here, and all of a sudden we owe them trillions of dollars. They didn't do anything to earn that money. They didn't create anything of value. And if we said, hey, we're not going to pay you any of that money back because we don't have any money, we're bankrupt, then what are they going to do, and how's that going to affect the economy? It's not going to affect the economy because, again, this bank it's just sitting on assets that are kind of in the ether. They're not. It's not anything. It's just debt. And if that debt goes away, then all that happens is our national debt goes down, and there are no real side effects to that.
Well, the assets that the Federal Reserve isn't a private bank. The Federal Reserve is owned by the government. It's just separate from the other three branches because they don't want corruption intertangling the two, right? Like that's a basic principle of the Federal Reserve.
Supposedly.
But I mean,
so basically,
I've never heard of someone owning property owning the Federal Reserve before.
So what I'm getting at this then is that you want to pay off the debt by A, ending federal agencies, and B, defaulting on loans and not paying them at all.
Not all loans, but a lot of the loans. A lot of the loans are illegitimate. Here's the problem. You and I are expected to pay these loans, but you and I did not borrow this money. We didn't sign for it. We didn't receive it. We didn't spend it. We never saw it. We never touched it. We don't know where it is. There was an audit of the Pentagon that says they lost like $20-some trillion over the past couple decades, which just happens to be what our national debt is. Where did all this money go? And who's responsible for it? The idea is that the government, if you look at, say you look at a business, right, and you're a bank, how much money can you lend to this business? The more money you lend, the more you're going to earn on interest, right? So you want to lend them as much as you possibly can, but you're going to look at their balance sheet, their income, to see how much you can possibly lend them. This is exactly what the Federal Reserve does to the United States to the United States government. It says, hey, what's your income? What's your annual income? Your revenue stream, and that's how much they steal from us in taxes. Now, if this were a regular bank lending to a business, and they were lending to a business that's, their entire revenue is based on theft, like, let's say the mafia, and suddenly the mafia gets arrested, they go to jail, and all of a sudden they have no income. What happens to the bank? The bank is screwed out of all of the money that they lent them, because, basically they were lending to a very risky business venture, which they should have known. They should have known where that money was coming from if they're going to lend that much money to them. And so now that the revenue stream is gone, the bank has to cut its losses. They have to see, hey, they're not breaking the law to raise this money that we were receiving. We're out of luck. And so when you look at the relationship between the Federal Reserve and the United States government, that's really the same thing. If you tell the United States government, hey, you're not allowed to steal anymore, their revenue stream goes way down, and the bank that lent them a lot of money is going to have a lot of trouble collecting the money that's owed.
So this goes back to your slogan, right? Your Dan, taxation is theft, Behrman.
Right.
So if I may, are you opposed to all taxation or some taxations, most taxations? Like, where do you fall on the line? Because to me, as a member of the party, I understand that the 16th Amendment is a travesty. It never should have been created. The Supreme Court had previously ruled that an income tax is unconstitutional. But at the same time, even the Founding Fathers understood that you collect revenue through tariffs, which as an economic student, I disagree with. And then you have sales tax, which to me seems like the most sensible thing, because a sales tax means you're participating in a game that the government is helping you facilitate with trade. Like, they're supposed to facilitate fair trade. So excising a sales tax is like giving a referee in a football game his commission,
Yeah.
So I don't.
Right.
Where do you fall on this line?
So I say this. I say all taxation is theft, but at the same time, I recognize there are legitimate ways for government to raise money through voluntary means. Now, you talk about sales tax, and that's a really good comparison, because it is less theft than, say, like an income tax or a property tax. But at the same time, it is still coercive, because if I have some money and you have some property, and I say, hey, let's exchange some of my money, my property for your property, which the Supreme Court says money is property, and the Supreme Court says we have an unalienable right to contract and trade our property, then there is no room for the government to come in there and say, well, hey, you guys are trading stuff, I want a piece of it. Now, if the government is actually helping to facilitate that, then yes. And that's actually, when you look at the idea of tariffs, that was kind of the idea behind it. The government is providing a navy to protect, vessels traveling back and forth between Europe, and that protection is basically what you're buying with the tariff. That's kind of the idea with a lot of these different things. But when you look at a sales tax, it's really not that. It's really just, it's taking that to an extreme. And it's also not voluntary, because what if somebody says, hey, I'm not interested in your protection. I want to either run the risk to go unprotected, or I want to pay for my own protection because I know my own protection is going to be, protecting my own ship and not off protecting someone else's ship. Kind of like if you look at, we pay property tax so that we have police. Why? So that people don't rob us, or if somebody does rob us, they'll come and write a report. But what do banks do? Do banks pay that tax to have police, or do they hire private security firms to drive armored trucks with armed guards to protect their money and move it from place to place? They don't ask for the government police to protect those armored trucks. They protect it themselves.
Well, they do.
So
they do both, though, right? I would argue that they do both, because they have companies, like you said, in the armored trucks, and that's transporting their money from one place to another. That's a business.
The Brinks trucks.
Yeah, so that's me saying, I'm going to take money from you to put your money in my car and drive it to whatever location you want. But at the same time, Brinks doesn't get called when people hold up a bank.
Yeah.
If someone walks into a bank with a gun, the cops come, the police come.
Well, you're right. You're right about that. But the idea is, what would happen if the police were not there for the bank to call? They would either hire their own investigator to find out who took it and try to track them down, or they'd buy insurance to protect that loss themselves.
Well, that was the idea of the Pinkertons back in the day.
Most money in banks is insured.
Well, even though the private security firm, that's Pinkertons. That's back when, in the 1800s,
something like that.
The Pinkerton Detective Agency were private cops.
Yeah, I'm not that familiar with that, but I don't know the exact dates. I've heard of it before.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's really kind of the idea. And, the idea is that, government does have legitimate ways to raise money, but if it's offering free stuff all over the place, then, who's going to turn it down? Why would a bank hire its own police force if it knows it can rely on the local police force, which is, essentially free, but it's not really free. It's subsidized by all of the people who live around the bank. But those police aren't protecting those people per se. They're protecting, they might protect the bank because the bank is going to call them more often. And the people who believe they're being protected by those police are not actually being served as well by those police as what they're paying for.
Well, banks also pay property tax, though, on the property that they sit on, don't they?
Sure. They pay all kinds of other taxes. FDIC is, you can look at that as a regular insurance policy. You pay a monthly premium and you're covering certain assets. Of course, the FDIC is really a really poorly run insurance company that actually, if you look back at the 2008 collapse, what happened was the banks were actually, and this is where I'd argue that, it wasn't necessarily the bank's bad policy so much as it was the government's bad policy that created that problem. Because it was, these banks were lending out as much money as the government said they could, and the government said, yeah, you can lend out as much as you want because we don't have to worry about a bank run because everything's insured by the FDIC. And what happened was when people actually did try taking their money out of the banks and they became insolvent, what happened was the FDIC was supposed to come in and say, here's all the money that we're insuring all these accounts with, but the FDIC didn't have any money. And so when we look at this $700 billion bailout that they had to do, that money actually didn't go to the banks to bail out the banks. That money went to the FDIC so that they could cover all of the banks that they had to purchase to shift assets around and consolidate those bad banks.
Okay, so let's talk more on an average Joe level, because what we're going in is getting into tax law, getting into economic policy. So
there's just one thing I wanted to ask quickly about the tax stuff.
Sure.
You said, since basically this goes back to your nickname being taxation is theft, you went along a little bit, but you didn't go too in depth. What would be like those voluntary measures that the government would use or you would use to raise funds then? Since
that is a good question. Yeah.
So somebody's charged with a crime. Usually they pay court fees. Somebody sues McDonald's for a couple $1 million. Well, McDonald's is losing and they have to pay a couple $1 million. This whole thing was facilitated it was all made possible by the courts. So the courts should receive a percentage of that as their fee for making sure that there was a fair trial, which there's already a system there for that. There's, as soon as you file, you have to pay court fees and everything else. There are the lottery, even though it's a monopoly, it's a voluntary way that people gamble in order to raise money for the government. There's the post office, which operates almost entirely without subsidy because it sells its service. And there's all different ways. We really need to look at, each department has its own way. The FDA even charges for its service. You have to pay if you want to get your drug certified. You have to pay the FDA to go through all this paperwork and everything else. The government does raise a lot of money without having to, just put a gun to someone's head and say, well, we're not helping you do what you're doing, but we want a piece of it. There are ways that people say, hey, I will receive something from you if I give you money. And we just have to look at that and say, okay, this is acceptable. Of course, we just have to look at it also that, if they're running a monopoly, that's one thing that we do need to put back in check.
So, the lottery, in what way is it a monopoly? Because that's tripped me up a bit.
Yeah.
Because to me, it's just another form of gambling, which is not monopolistic at all. You have casinos, you have track betting, especially in New York, Kentucky.
Especially in this area.
Yeah, because we're from Albany County. There's a track.
Saratoga.
20 miles from us?
Right.
Yeah, the Saratoga racetrack.
Yeah, so people here, they have choice. You can either play the lottery, you can play Keno at a bar, you can play slots at a convenience store.
You can go to a casino.
Yeah, casino, track. So I don't know, would you consider that a monopoly in the sense
there's
of what
even
they're
whole
selling?
websites for it now, like DraftKings or whatever.
You also have online betting with sports.
some very limited forms of gambling are legal, but for the most part, gambling is illegal in many parts of the country. Like Vegas, obviously, gambling's legal in many different ways. In California, where I grew up, there are a few Indian casinos where it's legal. Everywhere else in California, it's illegal. It has to be on Indian land. There's, you go to different places and they have, certain forms of gambling are legal. Actually, in California, there was one casino that was allowed to exist that wasn't on Indian land, and that one they were only allowed to play certain games. There's the online poker stuff. I don't know how restrictive that still is, but I worked with people who were in the payment industry, and it was illegal to move money around and participate in online gambling for a long time. This was after there was a big one that was operating offshore, which was legal offshore, but just because of their connections to the U.S. using the payment systems, they had to shut down. There are a lot of ways that, yes, there are different ways to gamble, but it's not, you can't just walk in and say, hey, I'm going to open a casino and do it. It's kind of like, the taxi monopolies where a lot of places are saying, well, we don't even want Uber or Lyft operating here because we want our taxi monopoly to run everything. So, yeah, sometimes there are some alternatives, but for the most part, the government does hold a monopoly on a lot of these things.
Well, that wouldn't really be a monopoly in my eyes, since that's not all controlled by one place.
Well, it's controlled by the government, and I see his point. I just think that the solution would be probably making casinos legal or making other gambling avenues.
So just open up more routes to gamble.
More routes to the same thing, and especially with Uber and Lyft in those cases that you're mentioning, I'm pretty sure if they hit the Supreme Court, they're going to get struck down because what you're doing is you're prohibiting a business in you're limiting limiting capitalism. You're limiting the free market. So that's
right. And here's what New York does. New York says, oh yeah, it's absolutely legal if you want to start a new taxi business. You just need to buy this, $10 million medallion in order to, it's basically like paying for a license to operate that business. And that license is so expensive that nobody can do it. So you basically have the one cab company. And they, in a lot of places, Uber and Lyft have tried the taxi companies have tried to push out Uber and Lyft, and because of what you're saying, the courts are saying no, sorry, we're going to allow it. But there are certain cities where it's still banned, or where instead of saying you can't operate, they just make it ridiculously restrictive. Like in Austin, Texas, they were requiring them to do fingerprint identification and all this other thing for all of their drivers in order to just make it really restrictive for them to operate. And for a while, they wouldn't even operate in Austin because of that.
So that's a barrier to entry. We're talking about needing to lower the barriers to entry, which we can all agree on.
Yeah.
Right. And the barrier to entry, I mean, we can call it that, but the reality is if you set that barrier high enough, then it's saying, no, you're not allowed to do business. We're just saying, yeah, it's a way of saying, yeah, you can do business, but saying, no, you can't do business.
So we were going to go more towards everyman stuff, which with the lottery, we've taken a really good segue here.
Yeah.
Sure.
Might just pick up a couple of lotto tickets on the way
home. Let's talk more about on a national level. What are your three things that you think are the most important right now for a president to address? Obviously, we talked about criminal justice reform. We've talked about taxes. What are those in your top three?
Yeah, I would say the taxes are definitely number one. Number two is probably healthcare, and number three, I might say education, which I think is suffering from the same problem as healthcare, which it's kind of a different problem, but it's a cost of doing business problem, where the healthcare is way too expensive because of government programs, because of special privileges that are given to banks that are doing student loans, where those, no other bank lending money for any other purpose is given that special privilege. You can't get rid of that debt through bankruptcy. You can pass that debt on to your children. There are some really bad policies in place that, shouldn't be there. And the only reason they are there is because these banks know that this is a really bad investment to give someone, $200,000 for for an education in something that there's no guarantee that they're ever going to be able to get a decent paying job in that field.
So we're talking post-secondary education then.
Yeah. So like the college student loans, that sort of thing.
Okay.
So you're talking about like.
Although I would say the Department of Education is one that needs to go pretty quickly also, and that's one that we look at how the K through 12 schools operate. The Department of Education is really doing nothing but sucking money out of that whole system and slowing everybody else down.
Yeah.
And it's trying to create a one size fits all that is just not working.
Well, the Dewey of Dewey Decimal fame even said of the public education system, it's designed to socialize. It's not designed to necessarily create the best education possible.
Yeah, it's not designed for education means.
It was how you were getting industrial workers prepped for industrial society.
Yeah, there's a whole entire movement now of people. It's kind of an underground movement trying to get people to kind of reform the way that schools are built and the way the education system's done.
Well, nuts to that, you should homeschool your kid. If you want an honest answer, the best thing to do is teach your kid a more universal concept of knowledge that allows him to expand and try new things and discover on his own what his talents are. Now, while that doesn't make him the most well-rounded person if you don't try, it also doesn't waste money, and it's also allowing you to impose your own moral values and your own traditional senses of what you think is right.
True, but I think that's all up to what everybody thinks for their own children, though.
Yeah, but we should all have the right to do what we think is best for our own children. Yeah, or instead of the government telling us what they think is best. That's what I was saying.
I was just saying it depends on what each person thinks with what they want to do with their child.
Right. But post-secondary, especially with the student loans, I think you're right about a lot about how the government's made it more expensive over time by guaranteeing these loans and not setting a limit to how much one student can take out in loans, which definitely messes up a bunch of people. It allows them to shirk off the first 2 years with no consequence. And you can tell since the government's been guaranteeing student loans, student education for post-secondary schools has quintupled in semesterly price or more.
Right.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah, it's, I went to community college for a couple years, and, that was something that I just paid out of pocket because it was, I think it was like a few $100s per semester. Same. And this wasn't, this was maybe 15, 20 years ago. And, like going through that and realizing that I took a lot of like interesting classes like philosophy and art and, all kinds of other stuff. I don't work in those fields at all. I work as a software engineer, and I learned that kind of on my own, doing my own research and learning and experimenting. And I know it's not the same path for everybody, but, there are trade schools. I know welding pays a lot, and it's a very good career, but that's not something you go to college for. And, you look at law school or med school. Those are something that, you would expect, hey, if you want to do that, you need to go to real college because that's a very, very specialized and very important field. But at the same time, when you look at the cost of where a lot of that money is spent, a lot of that education can be learned on your own through, whether it's an online academy or something like that, where it's, obviously not the experience, but as far as, the first couple years worth of book work, just learning whether it's anatomy or whether it's law, case law history and all this, you can learn that on your own. And I think that's really important to recognize, because we shouldn't be looking at like, hey, you need to go to law school and pay the full price the whole time that you're there, when a lot of this can be it's information that can be distributed a lot more efficiently through the internet. And we need to look at that as a legitimate way of transferring that information and teaching young people how to learn these new skills and get into these new fields that they want to get into.
So I want to pick your brain a little bit more on this topic because, like I said, I'm also a community college kid. I also went through the same thing. I'm at Siena now. Previously, I have a trade background. I'm a culinary graduate. I decided to make a career change, which is all on me. I don't blame anyone for my loans except myself, and I intend to pay them back in full. I'm against student loan forgiveness, specifically for that reason. And I think it's similar for you. because you seem to be someone who holds themselves accountable for their own choices. Now, I wanted to ask, I don't know if you paid attention to the gubernatorial race that we had up here in New York, but we had a libertarian candidate that suggested eliminating 12th grade in secondary school and allowing a preemptive placement into community college, the military ROTC programs, regular university, or to just go out into the workforce and gain experience before someone chooses to go to an actual school or not. Would you be in favor of implementing something like that on a national level?
Yeah, well, I'm okay with that plan. The problem I have is, I guess, with the words you're using, would I want to implement that? I think it's not something that needs to be implemented. It's people should kind of decide their own paths. They should be aware of all the options, and they should make that decision on their own. I know we do have a system that's in place, and we question, how do we convert into a more open and free system? But the reality is, if you get rid of the federal Department of Education and leave it to the states, and then maybe you start telling the states, hey, ease up on your statewide regulation of that and start allowing localization. Maybe you'll have one city that says, hey, we're going to try something new with our education system. We're going to get rid of 12th grade, just 12th grade. And then maybe they do something and it works great, and then they say, hey, we'll get rid of 11th grade too. And in doing this, what you see is you'll see different schools across the country, even private schools and charter schools, all different types, even home schools, figuring out different curriculums and different ways to transition their students into into the real world as they're kind of becoming that age. We'll see so many different things being tried because no one's being forced to, there's no plan that's being implemented. Everyone's kind of free to see what's working, try something new, put a spin on something else that's working, and try something that's just a little bit new or something that's radically new. And that's really what we need to do, because there might be some amazing thing out there that's like, hey, this is the absolute best way to get an education, the best way to be successful in life, and we don't even know it exists because we're too busy this is just the way that it's done. And we kind of need to get out of that and just, try new things and make our own decisions.
Okay. I mean, that's fair enough. I think that would yield interesting results, to say the least. My worry would be how to combat the educational inequality for the first few years when people are going into universities and universities are trying to pick traditional students and you have non-traditional students, and the disparity in education between the two, whether it be in favor of or against the new style of teaching. I'd be interested to see how that pans out, although I am in favor of what you're talking about. I think that's a good way to look at something. Right. If we may, we have about 10 minutes left. I want to talk briefly about foreign affairs. I know you're a big proponent of ending America's campaigns across the international lines. I hope I'm saying that right.
Yeah.
I want to say, yeah. Sorry.
That works.
Yeah.
International campaigns, just like the military defense and everything, bring back all the bases from abroad and everything. Are you in favor of removing all of our military bases?
Yeah, absolutely. There's no reason we need to have military bases in other people's countries. If we want those countries to be safe, then we can support them in whatever they want to do to build their own defenses. Otherwise, what we're doing there is we're being aggressive, and that's the reality of what most U.S. foreign policy is. We are the mafia arm of a lot of these big corporations that are just over there stealing resources and land. And that's not something, and it's something that you and I are paying for with our tax money to subsidize what these big corporations are doing to steal. One, they shouldn't be stealing. Two, we shouldn't be subsidizing it.
I have a few questions about this foreign policy thing, because we already have some obligations abroad with this. Like, what about stuff like NATO and the UN? What would you do with stuff like that, where we're members of an organization along with other nation states?
So, here's the thing I see with the UN. We pour a ton of money into it, and like you said, we create obligations. that's not necessarily what we should be doing. If anything, it should be a forum where we can get together and we can discuss things. But if you look at what the federal government was, the U.S. government used to be spelled with a lowercase u. It was the United States. It was a bunch of states that were united through this little contract. And this little contract became now this huge, massive military entity. And so now if we say, okay, well, that's what we're going to do with the UN, except internationally, that's where that could go if that's what people are expecting from it. But if we use it as like, hey, let's just have a forum where people from different countries will say, hey, there's this problem. Let's say it's global warming or pollution or, whatever these international problems are, and say, hey, we tried this in our country and it worked. Maybe you could try it in your country. Not forcing them to try it, but just saying like, hey, if you want to do better, this is going to help you. Then I think that would be a lot more acceptable way to kind of hold those conversations. But we shouldn't be engaged in kind of creating contracts with other countries that are going to obligate the citizens of this country to funnel tax money over there, or send our children off to die somewhere for some other purpose.
So
that's something that we shouldn't be doing.
Would you stay in these organizations, or would you pull out? Would you try to reform them in some way? What would you do? Would you stay, pull out?
I'd say reform them. Like, we just need to look at what our involvement in those organizations are, and we need to be able to say, look, we're not going to do certain things that we used to be doing, which a lot of it is us pushing other countries around. But that's really the thing. It should be a place to have conversation, not a place to force other people, to do certain things or implement certain policies.
So, how would you feel about embassies then? Are you willing to keep embassies open, or is it going with the military bases?
Yeah, I think embassies are fine. It's it's really, you can look at DHL is a good example. DHL has offices all over the world. Why? It's because they have a network, they provide a service, and that service kind of operates internationally. Right now, the U.S. kind of provides a service as far as passports, just because that's the way the world works, or, protecting its citizens abroad, that sort of thing. That's not something that we should directly pull out of. Do I want to get to a world where we don't have to worry about passports and borders and everything else? Yes, absolutely. But I know that's way down the road, and that's not something that we're just going to go in there and start yanking out embassies, and then, that would cause some pretty big problems.
And how about foreign aid?
Foreign aid we should definitely do away with. If somebody wants to assist another country, I know some people doing this now in Venezuela, in Cuba. I'm doing it myself to a few different countries in Africa where we're helping either individuals or organizations by donating time and information and whatever other help we can do. That's really the type of thing that we should be doing in terms of foreign aid. Another really interesting question about that is, we hear foreign aid and it's usually either about defense or, whatever their other economical problems are. You're traveling around the world like I have been for the last couple years, what I can really see is when, especially in Africa, where you have starving in Africa, it's not because there's no food. It's because you have basically tyrants taxing the life out of people. They're taxing the land. They're forcing them to live in really small areas where you can't grow crops. It's taxing the crops that they are growing. It's creating this poverty, and a lot of the foreign aid that comes from that goes to the dictators or the tyrants of these countries. They profit, they prosper, they grow, and they live like kings. Meanwhile, the people in that country they're just being taxed into starvation. So a lot of the foreign aid that we do just goes right into corrupt hands, and it's a really bad idea. If we want to help, we should be doing it as individuals with individuals in other countries.
So one thing, a lot of the stuff that's been in the news lately has been foreign policy based. I just wanted to ask you, what would you do in these two situations that have been in the news a lot, being North Korea and Iran?
Sure. So I guess Iran. You want to talk about the drone that was shot down?
Yeah, so I think he means diplomatically, how would you address
Yeah,
Kim
kind of just like
Jong-un and
the Ayatollah,
the Ayatollah of Iran?
kind of just like the sequence of events that's been going on with both.
Right. So you look at a lot of those. I mean, you look at Iran. 60 or 70 years ago, that was actually a much more prosperous country, and it was because of U.S. foreign policy going in, taking down their governments and replacing them with whatever we could come up with, because we wanted certain things out of. I keep using the word we, and I hate using that. But we destroyed that country. The United States government did, and now we're seeing the blowback. We're seeing everything else that are the effects of that. And the very first thing we need to do is stop making things worse. We have military bases completely surrounding Iran that don't need to be there because we're basically. How would we feel if Iran had military bases all along the border in Canada and Mexico surrounding the U.S.? That would probably make us pretty upset, and we'd probably, be initiating all kinds of violence against them, whether it's shooting down their ships or their aircraft.
And what of the Revolutionary Guard and their classification as a terrorist organization?
That's a more difficult problem, but. It's for one thing, whenever we get involved, every person that we kill creates more terrorists. That's the blowback. That's the way it's always going to happen. So we need to stop doing that. We need to start acting defensively. We need to stop messing around in other countries' affairs. And if anything, we can start trading. We can start de-escalating. We can start making friends with different groups. And say, hey, look, we're not the government of the past. We're not the government that's been harassing you for the past decades. This is new leadership. Things are going to change. We want to make peace. We want to trade, and we want to have a good relationship moving forward. And I absolutely believe that's possible.
And what about North Korea then?
I would say the same. We have a dictator who's living there, who was basically raised into the system and knows nothing else outside of that. The fact that he's already met with Trump shows, I think, that he's a little bit more open to having some sort of relationship with us. I think we just need to keep building on that and de-escalating. Here's the thing: if you look at that country, you have the leaders and the rulers and the military that are following the orders, but most of the people in that country do not want. They don't just wake up every morning and say, "Hey, I feel like going to war with somebody. I feel like fighting. I feel like killing." That's not what most people think.
It's a brainwashing effect. There's been plenty of North Korean refugees who have come across to South Korea and then to the United States and have done lectures on how from kindergarten they're trained to hate this country, which again is no fault of their own because it's a brainwashing thing. But thank you for answering those questions. We have 1.5 to 2 more questions before we go. It's still on foreign policy. It's about immigration and our relationship with our southern border. And also, we're kind of inquisitive about your website being run out of Cancun. So
it's actually the entire campaign that's being run out of Cancun. But yeah, I believe that we should live in a world without borders. I look at borders, and I know it's a very privileged view. Being a U.S. citizen, we have access to travel pretty much anywhere in the world, and other people in other parts of the world should have the same right. I don't see, like, even though I'm talking to you right now from Cancun, I don't see this as I'm in another country. I just see this as I'm in a different location on the same ball of dirt that's floating through space. So we're just human beings.
So I'm gonna press you on that just for a second now, because even as someone who believes in a world without borders, you can understand the common locked door trope, right? Which is, if you lock your door to your house, and as a libertarian, I'm assuming you're pro Second Amendment, which means the right to defend your personal property. How can you not then also believe in a country's right to remain sovereign? Because part of a country's sovereignty is borders. That's in the definition of sovereignty.
Well, Okay, so there's a lot of issues you're bringing up. One is sovereignty. In the United States, if you look back into more of like the organic law, you'll see that it's the individual who is the sovereign. We created the government. The sovereign is kind of like the highest on the hierarchy, and that's you and I. That's not the government. If I have a house and I want to bring a guest into my house inside of my locked door, and that person just happens to live in Mexico right now, or in South America, or South Africa, or Iran, but I know this person and I want to bring them into my home, I'm not allowed to without the government's permission. So the government is now threatening my sovereignty.
Well, it's under the constitutional right of the government to better the welfare of the nation, right? If they can't keep track of who's coming in and why, how are they supposed to protect the people? That's an individual's right against a public right? Which is a hard conversation to have, and I agree the individual should come first in most situations, but going on vacation to another country is different than having someone from another country live in your house undocumented.
Very different.
You know, like that's.
Well, let me ask you this: how do you know that the people coming into your city from the city next door or from the state next door are there to do good things?
We don't, but they have identification.
Yeah, they have identification provided by the government.
They have licenses.
I don't.
They have cars. They have license plates. We monitor
I
the
don't.
roads.
I've been traveling around the country without a driver's license or license plates for the past 10 years. And yes, I have been stopped by the police, and nothing that you would expect has come out of it. I haven't been arrested for it. But I am, for the most part, undocumented. The only thing that I do have is a passport, and that's because there's no other way I could get in and out of the country. But there are many other people like that. There are people who are born whose parents refuse to get them registered with the Social Security office, and they don't have Social Security numbers. Those people are living among us. There are lots of them, and they are peaceful people. They don't get arrested. They don't commit crimes, and they are here. Meanwhile, if you look at, you say driver's licenses, most of the people who get into car accidents have driver's licenses. Most of the people who get arrested for DUI have driver's licenses. It's kind of a false sense of security that we're told, and there's a lot of propaganda that we hear that, hey, there's all this crime, and if we open up the border, all these bad things are going to happen. Now, I'll admit there are a lot of problems. Ending the drug war is going to solve a lot of them, and opening up the border right now would be a bad idea. But, realistically, all of these problems that we have, all this propaganda that we hear, it's just that. It's propaganda, and it's fear, and that puts us into a very controllable state of mind when we're afraid of things that we don't understand, where we can be manipulated into voting for certain policies.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us today. I really appreciate the fact that we've been able to reach out and connect with you.
Yeah, very gracious.
Absolutely.
It's been a great time. Thank you, Dan Behrman, Libertarian candidate. The primaries are still going on, right?
Yeah, May 2020, we're going to have our convention where they select the nominee for the party.
All right, perfect. Well, I wish you the best of luck, and to any of the listeners out there, if there's another candidate that you think we should cover, feel free to send in your requests. Don't forget to email us at callingoutcontroversy@gmail.com. Don't forget to hit up our YouTube page. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and don't forget to like our Instagram page. Don't forget to hit up Dan Behrman's website to learn more if you're interested. And please stay tuned for the continuation of the Summer of Rights on 88.3 FM WBCR, the St. Dan, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.